Whistle for me one last time, Bratfisch. It was the most terrifying performance of the cab driver's life. Standing in a hunting lodge thick with the smell of stale champagne and gunpowder, he was ordered to whistle the cheerful, bouncing tunes of the Vienna streets for two lovers who were waiting to die. Josef Bratfisch was more than just a servant. He was the living witness to the madness of Mayerling. He was the man who chauffeured death itself in carriage number 147. And the secret he carried from that night was so heavy that it didn't just silence his music, it consumed him. Within just 3 years, the jolly fiacre king would wither away and die, eaten alive by the ghosts of the passengers he couldn't save. Josef Bratfisch was born into this world in 1847 in the Ottakring district, a working-class neighborhood that smelled of breweries and dust. He was not a servant in the traditional sense. He was a fiacre. In 19th century Vienna, a fiacre was not just a taxi driver. They were the celebrities of the pavement. They were the confidants of the rich and the protectors of the poor. They wore a distinctive uniform, a velvet jacket, a bowler hat tilted at a jaunty angle, and silver buttons that cost more than a peasant earned in a year. A good fiacre was arrogant, witty, discreet, and charming. Bratfisch was the best of them all. He was known as Nockerl to his friends, a nickname that implies a certain roundness and joviality. He wasn't much to look at physically, short, stocky, with a thick mustache that he waxed carefully. But he had a gift that made him legendary. He was a Kunstpfeifer, an artistic whistler. This wasn't just casual whistling. It was a musical discipline. Bratfisch could whistle entire operas. He could mimic the violins of a Hurrigan band. He could make his voice sound like a bird, a flute, or a weeping woman. In the wine taverns of Vienna, when Bratfisch stood up to perform, the room went silent. The aristocrats who slummed it in these taverns threw gold coins at his feet. This musical talent is crucial. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a form of emotional manipulation. The Viennese soul is famously melancholic. They love music that makes them cry while they drink. Bratfisch understood this. He knew how to read a room. He knew how to adjust his pitch to match the mood of his passengers. If a young officer was happy about a promotion, Bratfisch whistled a march. If a nobleman was sad about a lost love, Bratfisch whistled a tragic ballad. He was a therapist with a whip in his hand. Crown Prince Rudolf met Bratfisch in the mid-1880s. The meeting was inevitable. Rudolf was a man running away from himself. He hated the rigid, suffocating atmosphere of the Hofburg Palace. He hated his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, who was a cold bureaucrat, incapable of affection. He hated his wife, Stephanie, whom he found dull and annoying. Rudolf sought refuge in the night. He was an insomniac, driven by a hyperactive brain and the early stages of syphilis. He spent his nights prowling the city, looking for women, looking for alcohol, looking for anything that made him feel alive. He needed a driver who wouldn't talk. The court carriages were driven by imperial servants who reported everything to the police. Rudolf couldn't use them. He needed a freelancer. He needed a fiacre. When he stepped into Bratfisch's carriage, number 147, he found more than a driver. He found a friend. The bond between the prince and the driver was immediate and strange. They were opposites. Rudolf was overeducated, neurotic, liberal, and death-obsessed. Bratfisch was uneducated, earthy, simple, and full of life. But they shared one thing, a love for the real Vienna. Rudolf despised the fake politeness of the court. He loved the rough dialect of the streets, the bawdy jokes of the taverns, the raw sentimentalism of the folk songs. Bratfisch was the avatar of that world. When Rudolf sat in Bratfisch's carriage, he wasn't the crown prince. He was just a man listening to a song. Bratfisch became Rudolf's Liebfiaker, his personal private driver. This was an unofficial position, but it carried immense power. Bratfisch had access to the prince at all hours. He knew where the prince slept. He knew which actresses the prince visited. He knew how much the prince drank. In a surveillance state like the Habsburg Empire, where everyone was spying on everyone, Bratfisch held the keys to the kingdom's biggest secrets. But Bratfisch was not a blackmailer. He was fiercely, blindly loyal. He looked at Rudolf not with judgment, but with pity. He saw the shaking hands. He saw the dilated pupils from the morphine. He heard the prince muttering to himself in the back seat. Bratfisch's role evolved from driver to caretaker. He would often drive Rudolf around the Ringstrasse for hours in the middle of the night, just so the prince could calm down. He would whistle soft tunes to soothe Rudolf's nerves. He became a mother figure, a father figure, and a guard dog wrapped into one. The carriage itself became a sanctuary. It was a closed world, moving through the fog of Vienna, isolated from the laws of the court. Inside carriage 147, Rudolf could scream, cry, or pass out, and Bratfisch would ensure that no one saw. This level of intimacy created a dependency. Rudolf began to rely on Bratfisch more than his own advisors. When he wanted to escape his spies, he called Bratfisch. When he wanted to disappear, he called Bratfisch. By 1888, the situation was deteriorating. Rudolf's mental health was in freefall. The syphilis was attacking his nervous system. He suffered from blinding headaches and severe depression. He began to talk about death constantly. He asked his regular mistresses, notably Mizzy Kaspar, to enter a suicide pact with him. "Let's go to the Hussar temple and shoot ourselves," he would say. Mizzy laughed it off and went to the police, who ignored her. Bratfisch surely heard these conversations. He was the silent witness in the driver's seat, while Rudolf begged women to die with him. Imagine the burden on Bratfisch. He was a simple man who wanted to drive his horses and sing his songs. Instead, he found himself chauffeur to a slow-motion suicide. He must have seen the darkness growing. He must have noticed that the destinations were becoming more obscure, the moods darker. Yet, he stayed. Why? Because in the feudal code of the fiacre, loyalty to the Herr, master, was absolute. And perhaps because he loved Rudolf. He loved the broken, brilliant, kind-hearted man who treated a cab driver like a human being. The year 1889 opened with a sense of doom. The winter was harsh. The snow piled up in the narrow streets. The emperor was angry with Rudolf over his liberal politics. The crown princess Stephanie was estranged. Rudolf was cornered. It was in this atmosphere that Bratfisch's role shifted from driver to accomplice. He began to carry messages. He began to transport a new passenger, a young girl with huge dark eyes and a fanatical devotion to the prince. Her name was Mary Vetsera. Bratfisch knew Mary. He had driven many women for Rudolf, but Mary was different. She wasn't a prostitute or an actress. She was a baroness. She was 17 and she was obsessed. Bratfisch saw the way she looked at Rudolf like he was a god. He also saw the way Rudolf looked at her, not with lust, but with a terrifying kind of relief. Rudolf had finally found someone crazy enough to say yes to his death proposal. As January 29th approached, Bratfisch received his orders. He was to prepare the carriage for a long journey. He was to take them to Mayerling. He knew this wasn't a hunting trip. Rudolf didn't bring his hunting dogs. He didn't bring his friends. He brought the girl and the driver. Bratfisch checked the horses. He polished the leather. He prepared himself. He sensed with the instinct of a man who has lived on the streets his whole life that this was the final ride. The Fiacre King was about to become the coachman of death. He didn't run. He didn't report it to the police. He put on his bowler hat, climbed onto the box, and snapped his whip. He would drive his prince to the end of the line, even if that line was the grave. The tragedy of Mayerling had many players, emperors, popes, barons, but the only one who would be there when the curtain fell, the only one who would see the true face of the horror, was Josef Bratfisch. The interior of a Viennese fiacre is intimate. It is a small box of leather and velvet, designed for lovers and secrets. But in the late 1880s, carriage number 147 became a mobile hospital and a confession booth. Josef Bratfisch sat on the box, holding the reins, but his ears were tuned to the sounds coming from the cabin behind him. He didn't hear the whispers of romance anymore. He heard the hacking cough of a dying man. He heard the clinking of glass vials. He heard the groans of a prince whose body was rotting from the inside out. Rudolf was dying. The official court circulars said he had rheumatism or bronchitis. Bratfisch knew the truth. It was syphilis, the French disease. In the 19th century, before antibiotics, syphilis was a slow, torturous death sentence. It didn't just attack the body, it ate the mind. It caused blinding headaches, joint pain, and paranoia. To cope with the agony, Rudolf turned to morphine. He mixed it with champagne. He mixed it with brandy. By 1888, the heir to the throne was a high-functioning junkie. Bratfisch saw it all through the rearview mirror of his life. He saw the prince stumbling out of the back doors of the Hofburg, his eyes glassy, his hands shaking so hard he couldn't light a cigar. Bratfisch didn't judge. He simply climbed down, helped his master into the carriage, and tucked a blanket around his legs. He became a nurse in a bowler hat. He knew which routes were smoothest to avoid jarring Rudolf's aching joints. He knew which taverns had the strongest wine to numb the pain. The carriage rides became erratic. Rudolf couldn't sleep. The insomnia was brutal. At 2 a.m., when honest citizens were in bed, Bratfisch was harnessing his horses. Rudolf would jump in and scream, "Drive! Just drive!" They would tear through the empty streets of Vienna, hooves clattering on the cobblestones, going nowhere. They drove past the Stephansdom, past the Prater, past the Danube. Rudolf was running from his own thoughts. During these drives, the partition between master and servant dissolved. Rudolf spoke to Bratfisch not as a prince, but as a drowning man. He talked about his father, the emperor. "He waits for me to die," Rudolf would mutter. He talked about the emptiness of his life. "There is nothing left, Bratfisch. The glass is empty." Bratfisch listened. He nodded. He offered the simple, rough wisdom of the street. "It will pass, Imperial Highness. The sun comes up tomorrow." But they both knew the sun wasn't going to fix a rotting brain. Bratfisch also had to deal with the police. Vienna was a police state. The Prime Minister, Count Taffe, had spies everywhere. They followed Rudolf constantly. They wanted to know who he was seeing, what he was saying, and how sick he really was. Bratfisch treated this as a sport. He knew the alleys of Vienna better than any spy. He would pull sudden turns, double back through courtyards, and vanish into the fog, leaving the police agents cursing in the street. He was protecting his master's privacy with the skills of a getaway driver. Then there were the women. Rudolf was hypersexual, a common symptom of mania. He needed constant female company to validate his existence. Bratfisch drove them all. He drove the actresses, the aristocrats, and the prostitutes. He saw the parade of women entering and leaving the carriage. Most of them were meaningless distractions. But one woman scared Bratfisch, Mizzy Kaspar. Mizzy was a soubrette, an actress and high-class escort. She was Rudolf's long-term lover. She was tough, cynical, and smart. Bratfisch liked her. But in late 1888, the drives to Mizzy's house changed. Rudolf wasn't going there for sex. He was going there to beg. Bratfisch waited outside, smoking his pipe, while upstairs, Rudolf was pleading with Mizzy to commit suicide with him. Die with me, he urged her. We can do it at the Hussar Temple. It will be beautiful. Mizzy refused. She went to the police. She told them, the Crown Prince is dangerous. He wants to kill himself. The police ignored her. They thought it was just lovers' drama. But Bratfisch knew. He saw Rudolf coming out of Mizzy's house, dejected, angry, looking like a man who had been denied his final wish. The rejection pushed Rudolf further toward the edge. He needed a partner for his death dance, and if the professional mistress wouldn't do it, he would find someone naive enough who would. Enter the darker side of Bratfisch's loyalty. He began to procure things, not just women, but silence. When Rudolf was too drunk to walk, Bratfisch carried him. When Rudolf vomited blood, Bratfisch cleaned the carriage before the morning inspection. He was scrubbing away the evidence of the monarchy's collapse. He was the keeper of the Habsburg filth. If he had spoken to a journalist, he could have brought down the government. He never said a word. The physical toll on Rudolf was becoming impossible to hide. He wore heavy makeup to cover the sores and the pallor. He wore corsets to hold himself upright. But in the carriage, the makeup came off. Bratfisch saw the skull beneath the skin. He heard the weeping. It is a terrifying thing to hear a future emperor cry like a child in the dark. It strips away the awe. Bratfisch stopped seeing a prince. He saw a wounded animal caught in a trap. As January 1889 began, the carriage rides took on a finality. Rudolf started giving things away. He gave his cigarette case to a friend. He gave money to his servants. He was clearing the decks. Bratfisch received gifts too. Extra tips, kind words. It felt like a long goodbye. The destination was no longer the opera or the tavern. The destination was Mayerling. Bratfisch knew Mayerling well. It was a hunting lodge in the Vienna woods, isolated and gloomy. Rudolf loved it because it was far from his father. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Bratfisch drove Rudolf there repeatedly. The lodge was being prepared. Guns were cleaned. Wine was stocked. It was the staging ground for the final act. Then came the passenger who changed everything, Mary Wetzera. She was 17. She was a baroness, but she was new money. Her mother was a social climber who wanted Mary to marry well. Mary didn't want marriage. She wanted the prince. She was a fanatic. She stalked him. She wrote him letters. When Rudolf finally noticed her, he didn't see a lover. He saw a vessel. He saw a girl stupid enough and romantic enough to say yes to the question Mizzy Casper had refused. Bratfisch drove the carriage that facilitated this affair. He picked Mary up in secret locations. He watched her climb in, her face flushed with excitement, clutching a muff or a fan. She thought she was entering a fairy tale. Bratfisch looked at her and likely felt a pit in his stomach. He knew what she was climbing into. She was climbing into a hearse. Did he try to warn her? No, it wasn't his place. A fiacre does not speak to a baroness unless spoken to. But he must have looked at her with a heavy heart. He was driving a lamb to the slaughterhouse. The conversations in the carriage changed. It wasn't Rudolf monologuing about death anymore. It was whispers, giggles, the manic energy of a shared secret. Rudolf was grooming her for death. He fed her romantic nonsense about eternal love and union in the beyond. On January 28th, the order came. To Mayerling. This was the big one. Bratfisch loaded the luggage. He checked the horses. The air was thick with tension. Rudolf was agitated. Mary was ecstatic. She had run away from home to be with him. She left a note for her mother that practically screamed suicide, but she framed it as a great romantic adventure. As Bratfisch climbed onto the box that morning, he wasn't just driving a carriage. He was the ferryman on the river Styx. He was Charon. He was taking two souls across the water to the land of the dead. The wheels turned. The city of Vienna faded behind them. The woods closed in. The stage was set for the macabre concert, and the conductor was holding the reins. The passenger, who changed history, stepped into Josef Bratfisch's carriage on January 28, 1889. She was 17 years old. Her name was Mary Vetsera. To the history books, she is the tragic heroine or the seductress. To Bratfisch, watching from his perch on the driver's box, she must have looked like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. She was small, voluptuous, with dark, heavy eyes that burned with a fanatical intensity. She didn't walk. She floated on a cloud of romantic delusion. Bratfisch knew women. He had driven the cynicism of Mizzy Casper. He had driven the boredom of Princess Stephanie. Mary was different. She was dangerous because she was innocent. She believed the lie. She believed that dying with a prince was better than living as a baroness. When she climbed into carriage number 147, she brought a feverish energy with her. She wasn't scared. She was ecstatic. She was finally the main character in the dark opera she had written in her head. The logistics of that morning were sloppy, almost comical if they weren't so deadly. Mary had lied to her mother. She said she was going shopping. She ran away from her chaperone at the sprawling Grand Hotel, slipped out a side door, and jumped into the waiting carriage. Bratfisch was the getaway driver for a teenage runaway. He snapped the reins and the horses surged forward. They weren't just fleeing a mother, they were fleeing reality. Rudolf was waiting. When the prince and the baroness were finally together in the leather-upholstered cabin, the dynamic was terrifying. Bratfisch, with his acute hearing, would have caught the tone. It wasn't the passionate whispers of a new affair. It was the desperate, breathless talk of a cult pact. Rudolf, 30 years old and rotting from syphilis, was feeding off her youth. He was a vampire draining her vitality to fuel his final act. Mary, blind with adoration, was feeding off his melancholy. She wanted to save him, or if she couldn't save him, she wanted to burn with him. Bratfisch turned the carriage south. The destination was Mayerling. The journey takes about 2 hours by horse. It is a transition from civilization to wilderness. They left the bustling, noisy streets of Vienna, passed the suburban villas, and entered the Hellenental, the Valley of Helen. The road winds through the Vienna woods. In January, the trees are black skeletons against a gray sky. The snow was deep. The air was biting cold. As they drove deeper into the woods, the silence of the forest swallowed them. Bratfisch was alone with his thoughts. He was a man of the city. He liked noise, beer halls, and paved streets. The woods made him uneasy. He must have wondered why they were going to a hunting lodge without guns. He must have wondered why the prince looked like a ghost and the girl looked like a bride. Inside the carriage, Mary was likely clutching a small iron box. This is a detail often missed. She brought a small box containing her will and letters to her family. She had written them days before. "I am going to the Danube," one letter said. She had planned this. For a 17-year-old girl to pack her jewelry and her death notes in a box and go shopping is a level of dissociation that chills the blood. Bratfisch might have helped load her small bag. Did he feel the weight of that iron box? Did he wonder why a girl going for a romantic getaway was carrying her last will and testament? The road to Mayerling is lonely. There were few other travelers. Just the wind, the creak of the wheels, and the snorting of the horses. Bratfisch drove with the mechanical precision of a professional, but his mind must have been racing. He was the guardian of the heir to the throne. His job was to protect Rudolf. But how do you protect a man from himself? How do you protect a man who is holding the hand of his own executioner? Bratfisch chose silence. It was the only armor he had. Rudolf spoke to him occasionally during the stops. He asked about the road. He asked about the weather. He was maintaining the facade of normalcy. but his eyes gave him away. They were dead. The morphine had taken the light out of them. He was a walking corpse, merely waiting for the biological function to catch up with the spiritual reality. Mary, on the other hand, was alive. She was chattering. She was excited. She was going to her wedding, even if the altar was a bed and the ring was a bullet. When the carriage finally pulled up to the gates of the Mayerling hunting lodge, the trap snapped shut. The lodge was low, yellow, and uninviting. It wasn't a palace, it was a bachelor pad designed for drinking and shooting. The trees pressed in close to the walls. It felt claustrophobic. Bratfisch halted the horses. The steam rose from their flanks in the freezing air. He climbed down to open the door. Mary stepped out into the snow. She was shivering, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from adrenaline. Rudolf followed, moving stiffly. They didn't look back at the road to Vienna. They walked into the lodge, and the heavy doors closed behind them. Bratfisch was left outside with the horses and the servants. The valet, Loschek, was there. They exchanged looks. Servants always know. Loschek knew about the guns. Bratfisch knew about the girl. They were the silent chorus of this tragedy. They unhitched the horses and took them to the stables. They warmed their hands by the fire in the servants' quarters. But the air in Mayerling was heavy. It tasted of metal. The sun went down over the Vienna woods. Mayerling became a black box buried in the snow. Inside the lodge, the servants had been dismissed to the outer quarters. The heavy oak doors were bolted. The stage was set for the smallest, deadliest audience in history. In the main bedroom, 3 people gathered. 2 were planning to die. 1 was hired to make them smile while they did it. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, spilled champagne, and the metallic tang of fear. Rudolf sat in a leather armchair. He was likely in his dressing gown. His face was flushed, his eyes bright and feverish. The syphilis was burning through his brain, and the morphine was trying to put out the fire. Beside him sat Mary Vetsera. She was still in her dress, looking like a doll that had been taken out of its box and placed in a scene it didn't understand. And standing near the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot, was Josef Bratfisch. "Entertain us, Bratfisch," Rudolf commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the desperate order of a man terrified of silence. Silence meant thinking. Thinking meant realizing that he was about to blow his own brains out. He needed noise. He needed the comforting, mindless noise of the Vienna he was leaving behind. Bratfisch wetted his lips. He was the Feker king, the man who could charm a tavern full of drunks. But this was a nightmare. He looked at the gun on the table. He looked at the girl. He took a breath and began to whistle. Bang. It was over. The concert was finished. The audience was dead. Josef Bratfisch stood up. He buttoned his coat. He wiped a tear, or perhaps a snowflake, from his mustache. The Feker king was gone. The man who walked toward the lodge to discover the bodies was a ghost. He had just played the soundtrack to the fall of the Habsburg Empire, and the silence that followed would ring in his ears for the rest of his short, miserable life. The silence that followed the second gunshot was heavier than the gunshot itself. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the Mayerling lodge. Outside in the stables, Josef Bratfisch stood up. He didn't run toward the house immediately. He knew his place. He was a cab driver. You don't burst into the Crown Prince's bedroom unless you are summoned. So he waited. He watched the windows. He watched the smoke from the chimney rising straight up into the frozen morning air. He waited for the scream. It didn't come from a woman. It came from a valet. Johann Loschek, Rudolf's personal valet, had been sleeping in the antechamber. He heard the shots. He was terrified. He knocked on the door. "Imperial Highness?" Silence. He knocked again, louder. "Highness, the carriage is ready." Silence. Loschek tried the handle. Locked. The panic set in. He ran to find Count Hoyos, Rudolf's hunting companion, who was staying in a separate wing of the lodge. Bratfisch was called from the stables. They needed muscle. They needed tools. The scene in the hallway was one of paralyzed fear. Here were grown men, powerful men, standing before a wooden door, terrified of what was on the other side. They could smell it now. The distinct, sulphurous sting of gunpowder. It seeped through the cracks in the wood, overpowering the smell of stale champagne and pine. "Break it down," Hoyos ordered. Bratfisch grabbed a hatchet, or perhaps a heavy piece of wood, accounts vary, and struck the door panel. Smash. The wood splintered. He struck again. He was breaking into the Holy of Holies. He was violating the sanctity of the imperial bedroom. With one final heave, the lock gave way, or a panel was smashed in enough to reach the handle. The door swung open. The smell hit them first. It wasn't just gunpowder. It was the copper tang of fresh blood and the bowel-loosening smell of death. The shutters were closed, so the room was dim, lit only by the dying candles. Bratfisch stepped over the threshold. What he saw burned itself onto his retinas forever. Rudolf was sitting, or half-slumped, on the edge of the bed. He had leaned forward. There was a pool of blood on the floor. His head was shattered. The bullet had entered the temple and exited the top of the skull. The Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, the hope of the liberals, the future of the dynasty, was a broken doll with half a face, and beside him lay Mary. She looked peaceful, in a grotesque way. She was lying on the bed, fully clothed. She held flowers in her hands, flowers that she must have arranged herself before the end. Her head was tilted. There was blood, but less of it. Rudolf had shot her first. He had seemingly arranged her body with care, then sat down to drink a final glass of brandy before turning the gun on himself. Bratfisch stood there, his bowler hat in his hands, staring at the carnage. Just hours ago, this room had been filled with his music. Just hours ago, he had been whistling the Blue Danube while that girl smiled at him. Now, she was meat. The contrast was too much for the human mind to process. The cheerful yodels were still echoing in his head, clashing with the sight of brain matter on the pillow. The room erupted into chaos. Count Hoyos lost his composure. Loschek was weeping, but Bratfisch went quiet. He looked around the room with the eye of a man who knows the streets. He saw the empty champagne bottles. He saw the gun, a bulldog revolver, lying on the floor, dropped from Rudolf's lifeless hand. He saw the mirror, which Rudolf had reportedly used to aim the shot. Then came the cover-up. It started instantly. Before the bodies were even cold, the machine of the Habsburg monarchy began to spin the narrative. He died of a heart attack, someone said, or an aneurysm. They couldn't admit suicide. Suicide was a mortal sin. A suicide could not be buried in the imperial crypt. A suicide meant the heir to the throne was damned to hell. And they certainly couldn't admit murder. They couldn't admit that the crown prince had shot a teenage girl. That would destroy the monarchy. Bratfisch watched them panic. He saw the aristocrats trying to rearrange reality. They ignored Mary. They treated her body like an inconvenient piece of furniture. They focused entirely on Rudolf. They tried to clean his face. They tried to make him look presentable. But Bratfisch knew the truth. He looked at the gun. He looked at the girl. He knew this wasn't a heart attack. The sound that came out was pure, high, and trembling with forced joy. He whistled the Fiakerlied, the anthem of the carriage drivers. It's a song about pride, about horses, about the simple joy of trotting through the city. I am a carriage driver, like no one else. The happy bouncing melody filled the room. It bounced off the hunting trophies on the walls. It swirled around the couple sitting in the gloom. It was grotesque. Imagine a clown performing at an execution. That was Bratfisch. He yodeled. He mimicked the sound of a violin. He sang the sentimental ballads of the Hurrigan. Drink, brother, drink, for the world is fleeting. Never had lyrics been so literally, terrifyingly true. Rudolf leaned back, closing his eyes. For a moment, the music worked. The lines of pain on his face smoothed out. He was transported back to the taverns of Döbling, back to the nights of wine and laughter, before the disease, before the politics, before the trap closed. He hummed along. He tapped his finger on the armrest. He was dissociating. He was leaving his body before the bullet even hit him. Mary's reaction was even more disturbing. She didn't look scared. She looked enchanted. She watched Bratfisch with wide, admiring eyes. She smiled at Rudolf. To her, this wasn't a funeral rite. It was a private concert for lovers. She was so deep in her delusion that she couldn't hear the death rattle in the music. She poured more champagne. She clinked glasses with Rudolf. She was playing house in a burning building. Bratfisch kept going. His throat must have been dry. His heart must have been hammering against his ribs. He switched to a waltz. The beautiful blue Danube, the most famous song in Austria, a song about a river. Mary had written in her suicide note, "I am going to the Danube." Now the river was coming to her. Bratfisch whistled the swirling 3/4 time signature. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It is a dance of life, of movement, of spinning ball gowns. But in this room, nothing moved. The air was stagnant. The waltz sounded like a ghost story. How long did he play? An hour? 2? It felt like an eternity. Bratfisch was fighting a battle against the inevitable. As long as he whistled, they were alive. As long as the music played, the guns stayed on the table. He was keeping them tethered to the earth with a melody. He poured his soul into every note, trying to whistle them back from the edge. Look, the music seemed to say, life is sweet. The wine is good. The girls are pretty. Don't go. But Rudolf wasn't listening to the life in the music anymore. He was listening to the end of it. He started to look at his watch. He started to glance at the door. The morphine was wearing off, or perhaps kicking in harder. The demons were coming back. The music wasn't enough. Finally, Rudolf raised a hand. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, physical, crushing. The echo of the last happy note died in the corners. "Thank you, Bratfisch," Rudolf said. His voice was flat. "That was beautiful." Then came the dismissal. It was polite, cold, and final. "You can go now. We are going to sleep." Sleep. The euphemism hung in the air. Bratfisch knew what kind of sleep it was. He looked at Mary. She was still smiling, flushed with wine and romance. She didn't know, or she refused to know, that she would never hear music again. Bratfisch wanted to grab her. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to scream, "Run, you stupid child!" But he couldn't. He was a servant. He was a fiacre. The barrier of class was stronger than the barrier of death. You do not touch the crown prince. You do not touch his mistress. You obey. Bratfisch bowed. It was the hardest bow of his life. He picked up his hat. He backed out of the room. As he closed the heavy door, he heard the lock click. Click. That sound was louder than any gunshot. It was the sound of the tomb sealing shut. Bratfisch walked down the hallway. His legs felt like lead. He went out into the courtyard. The cold air hit him like a slap. He walked to the stables where his horses were sleeping, warm and alive. He sat down on a crate. He put his head in his hands, and he waited. He didn't whistle anymore. The music was dead. Inside his head, the happy tunes he had just performed turned into a screeching mockery. He had given them their last rites, not with a prayer, but with a yodel. He had validated their madness with applause. He felt complicit. He felt dirty. The hours ticked by. The night was silent. The snow fell softly, covering the tracks, covering the world in white. Bratfisch sat in the dark, straining his ears. He wasn't waiting for a melody. He was waiting for the percussion. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn touched the tops of the trees, it came. Bang. A pause. A long, terrible pause. Maybe Mary didn't die instantly. Maybe Rudolf hesitated. Maybe he cried. Bratfisch held his breath. It was a massacre, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he was the only witness who didn't have a title. He was the loose end. He was the liability. "Not a word," Count Hoyos commanded, "to anyone. If you speak of this, you will be destroyed." Bratfisch nodded. He understood the code. He was a fiacre. He saw sins every day, but this sin was too big to fit in a confessional. The doctors arrived later. They confirmed death. The telegrams were sent to Vienna. The Crown Prince is dead. The lie about the heart attack was broadcast to the world. Vienna went into mourning, thinking their prince had died of natural causes. But in Mayerling, the blood was still wet on the floor. Bratfisch was given a task. He had to help move the bodies. He had to touch them. He had carried Rudolf when he was drunk. Now he had to carry him when he was dead. The body was heavy, dead weight. The rigor mortis hadn't set in yet. Rudolf was limp. As Bratfisch lifted the man who had been his friend, his master, and his burden, he likely felt a surge of anger. Why? Why did you do this? Why did you make me sing for you before you did this? And then there was Mary. The men in the room looked at her with disgust. She was the temptress. She was the one who lured him to this. They wanted to erase her. "Get her out of here," was the sentiment. "Hide her." Bratfisch looked at the girl. He didn't see a temptress. He saw a child who had been promised a fairy tale and given a bullet. He felt a protective urge, even now. He wanted to cover her face. He wanted to treat her with the dignity that the archdukes denied her. As the sun fully rose over Mayerling, the horror of the situation crystallized. The empire had no heir. The emperor had no son. And the only people who knew the full, unvarnished truth were a valet, a count, and a whistling cab driver. Bratfisch walked out of the death room. He needed air. He needed to wash the smell of blood off his hands. He went to his horses. They were the only innocent things left in Mayerling. He stroked their noses. He checked the carriage. It was still waiting. It was waiting for a passenger that would never return. But the work wasn't done. The cover-up required one more act of desecration. They couldn't just leave Mary there. They couldn't bury her with the prince. They had to smuggle her out. They had to pretend she was never there. And who do you call when you need to transport a body secretly through the night? You call the fiacre. Bratfisch received his final order. It wasn't to drive Rudolf home. It was to dispose of the evidence. He looked at his carriage, the carriage of secrets, the carriage of music, and realized it was about to become a hearse. The bloody dawn was over. The macabre cargo was next. The order came down from Vienna. Remove the woman, not bury the Baroness, not return the child to her mother. Just remove her. To the Habsburg crisis management team, Mary Vitsera was not a human being anymore. She was evidence. She was a stain on the carpet that needed to be scrubbed out before the public was allowed into the room. Josef Bratfisch stood by his carriage in the freezing courtyard. He watched the arrival of two grim-faced men. They were Georg Stockau and Alexander Baltassi, Mary's uncles. They had been summoned to do the dirty work. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to mitigate the scandal. They were told that if they didn't make Mary disappear quietly, her family would be ruined. Her mother would be exiled. Her name would be destroyed. They accepted the blackmail. Then began the most grotesque scene in the history of the Austrian monarchy. They couldn't just carry a body out the front door. There were too many eyes. Peasants were watching. Guards were watching. If anyone saw a limp corpse being loaded into a wagon, the heart attack lie would explode. They needed an illusion. They needed Mary Vetsera to look alive for one last ride. Bratfisch watched in horror as they went into the death chamber. Rigor mortis had begun to set in. The body was stiff. They had to force her limbs into a sitting position. They dressed her in her fur coat. They put her hat on her head, pulling it low to shadow her face. But a dead body doesn't sit up straight. It slumps. It falls. So they improvised. History tells us they used a piece of wood, perhaps a broomstick or a walking stick. They shoved it down the back of her coat, turning her spine into a rigid line. They turned the 17-year-old girl into a marionette. Bratfisch was told to bring the carriage around, not the hearse, the fiacre, the party carriage. They dragged the body out. To a distant observer, it might have looked like a drunk woman being supported by two uncles. They hoisted her into the back seat. Stockhouse sat on her left. Baltazzi sat on her right. They jammed her body between them so she wouldn't topple over when the carriage hit a bump. Bratfisch climbed onto the box. He looked back. Through the small window, he could see the three passengers, two living men pale and sweating with fear, and between them, the girl he had whistled for. She was sitting upright, her eyes likely closed or staring blankly beneath the brim of her hat. She looked like a wax doll. Drive, they told him, to Heiligenkreuz. Heiligenkreuz Abbey was miles away through the forest. The weather had turned brutal. A blizzard was kicking up. The wind was screaming through the trees. Bratfisch snapped the reins. Carriage 147 lurched forward. The journey was a nightmare. The road was icy and rutted. Every time the carriage hit a pothole, the dead girl's head would bobble. The uncles had to hold her up. They were terrified of passing anyone on the road. If they saw another traveler, they had to act. They pretended to talk to her. "Are you cold, Mary? Look at the snow, Mary." They were performing a play for an audience of none, talking to a corpse to keep the lie alive. Bratfisch heard the murmuring behind him. He heard the one-sided conversation. It made his skin crawl. He gripped the reins until his knuckles were white. He was driving the macabre cargo. He felt the weight of the death behind him physically. It was a violation of every superstition he held dear. You do not treat the dead like this. You do not make them pretend to be alive. It invites a curse. The wind howled louder, almost sounding like the whistling he had performed the night before. Bratfisch tried to block it out. He focused on the road. He focused on the horse's ears. He tried to forget that the girl, who had smiled at his yodeling, was now a frozen prop in a political theater. They arrived at the cemetery of Heiligenkreuz in the dead of night. The abbot had been bullied into accepting the body. The police were there. The grave had been dug hastily in a corner near the suicide plot, though they officially claimed she was being buried there due to lack of space. It was a lie on top of a lie. Bratfisch stopped the carriage. The uncles climbed out. They had to pry themselves away from the body. They pulled Mary out. She was stiff, frozen, in the sitting position. They had to carry her awkwardly to the grave. There was no priest. There was no family. There was no music. Bratfisch watched from the driver's seat. He didn't help them carry her. That was their sin, not his. He watched them lower the girl into the cold, wet earth. They threw the dirt on top of her quickly. They wanted to cover her up before the world woke up. There is a story, perhaps a legend, perhaps truth, that as the dirt hit the coffin, if there even was a coffin, some say she was buried in a sack, Bratfisch took off his bowler hat. He stood in the storm, his head bowed. He was the only one there who actually cared about her. The uncles were ashamed of her. The priests were disgusted by her. But Bratfisch remembered the music. He remembered the life. He paid his respects to the fatal passenger he had failed to save. Then it was over. The grave was filled. The men dusted off their hands. They got back into the carriage. Back to Mayerling, they ordered, or perhaps back to Vienna. Bratfisch turned the horses around. The carriage was lighter now. The cargo was gone. But the ghost remained. The smell of her perfume and the smell of death still lingered in the leather upholstery. Bratfisch drove back through the storm, empty. He felt a deep, crushing melancholy. The Viennese call it Weltschmerz, world weariness. He had seen behind the curtain of the empire. He had seen that the golden eagle of the Habsburgs was just a vulture, picking at the bones of a teenage girl. He returned to a city that was already buzzing with rumors, but he couldn't speak. He went home to his wife, to his small apartment in Ottakring. He probably washed his clothes. He probably washed the carriage, but he couldn't wash the memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl propped up in the back seat, nodding along to the rhythm of the wheels. The macabre cargo was the turning point for Bratfisch. Before this, he was a jolly man. After this, he was a haunted man. He had participated in a desecration. He had helped the powerful erase the weak. And the guilt of that drive, the drive where he chauffeured a dead girl through a blizzard, would sit on his chest like a stone until the day he died. The funeral of Crown Prince Rudolf was a grand lying spectacle. He was buried in the Capuchin crypt with full honors after the doctors invented a medical certificate claiming he was mentally unbalanced to bypass the church's ban on suicides. The emperor stood like a stone statue. The court wept on cue. But one person was missing from the public performance of grief: Empress Elizabeth. Sisi. Sisi was a wanderer. She hated the court. She hated the lies. When the news of Mayerling broke, she didn't collapse. She froze. Her son was dead, her only son. And all around her, the vultures of the administration were trying to rewrite the story. They told her he died of a heart attack. Then they told her it was an accident. Then they told her he was poisoned. Sisi knew them. She knew they were liars. She needed the truth, not the official truth that would be printed in the newspapers, but the raw, bloody human truth. She needed to know what her son felt in his last moments. Was he scared? Was he crying? Was he thinking of her? She couldn't ask the emperor. He was too busy saving the monarchy. She couldn't ask the police. They were covering their tracks. So she did something forbidden. She sent for the cab driver. Josef Bratfisch was terrified. A summons to the Hofburg Palace usually meant prison or interrogation. He put on his best Sunday coat. He waxed his mustache. He walked through the back entrances, guided by silent servants, through the labyrinth of the palace. He felt small. The Hofburg was designed to make people feel small. The ceilings were too high. The gold was too bright. It was a cage, just as Rudolf had said. He was led into a private drawing room. The curtains were drawn. The room was dark, smelling of beeswax and heavy black mourning fabric. In the center of the room stood the empress. Sisi was 51 years old, but she still possessed the legendary ghostly beauty that had made her famous. She was dressed entirely in black. Her face was hidden behind a fan and a veil, but Bratfisch could feel her eyes. They were the same eyes as Rudolf's, intelligent, nervous, and infinitely sad. She motioned for the servants to leave. They were alone. The Empress of Austria-Hungary and the fiacre of Ottakring. "Come closer," she lightly whispered. Her voice was famously soft. Bratfisch approached. He fell to his knees. He started to stammer an apology or condolence using the formal court German he had picked up. "Your Imperial Majesty, I am unworthy." Sisi cut him off. She didn't want protocol. She wanted a mother's answers. "Stand up," she commanded. "Look at me and tell me everything." She didn't want the sanitized version. She asked him the questions that no one else dared to ask. How was he? She asked. Bratfisch had to make a choice. He had been sworn to secrecy by the police. He had been threatened by the Prime Minister. If he spoke, he could be arrested for treason. But looking at the woman in black, he realized that her authority was higher than the law. She was the grieving mother. He began to speak. He spoke in the rough dialect of Vienna, the language Rudolf had loved. He told her about the drive. He told her about the mood in the carriage. He was calm, Majesty, Bratfisch said. He wasn't raving. He was sad, but he was sure. Cece listened, statue still. She asked about the girl. This was the knife in her heart. Mary Vitsera, the girl who had taken her son away. Did he love her? Bratfisch hesitated. Did Rudolf love Mary, or did he just use her? Bratfisch chose the kindest truth. He needed her, Majesty. She made him feel not alone. Then came the hardest question. The end, Cece said, the night. What did you do? Bratfisch took a breath. He told her about the whistling. It sounded insane in the quiet luxury of the palace. He asked me to whistle, Majesty. He wanted the Fiaker lied. He wanted the blue Danube. I whistled for him until he told me to stop. Cece didn't recoil. She didn't get angry that a low-born driver had entertained her son on his deathbed. She understood. She knew Rudolf's soul. She knew he hated the pomp of the court. Of course he wanted a Fiaker song. Of course he wanted the sounds of the street. It made sense to her in a way it never would to the emperor. He was happy, she asked, her voice trembling. He was at peace, Majesty. Bratfisch lied slightly. Or perhaps it was the truth as he saw it. The music, it took the pain away for a little while. Cece began to weep. Not the polite tears of the funeral, but real racking sobs. She realized that in his final hours her son had found more comfort in the company of this simple man than he had ever found in his own family. Bratfisch had been the father figure Rudolf needed. Bratfisch had been the priest. She walked over to him. This was a breach of all etiquette. An empress does not approach a servant. She took his hand, his rough, calloused hand that held reins and cleaned stables. Thank you, she said. Thank you for not leaving him alone. She asked if Rudolf had left a message for her. Bratfisch knew Rudolf had written letters, but he hadn't seen them. But he offered her something else. He spoke of you often, Majesty, on the drives. He said you were the only one who understood the cage. This was the absolution Cece needed. She felt guilty for being absent, for traveling constantly, for running away from Vienna. Bratfisch gave her the gift of knowing that Rudolf didn't hate her for it. He identified with her. They were both prisoners. The interview lasted a long time. When it ended, Cece was changed. She had touched the reality of her son's death. It was ugly, yes, but it was real. It wasn't the heart attack lie. She didn't just dismiss Bratfisch with a wave. She ensured his future. She knew the police would try to crush him. She knew the court would try to silence him. Cece personally intervened. She arranged for Bratfisch to receive a Gnadenlohn, a mercy pension. It was a substantial sum of money, enough to buy his own horses, his own carriage license, enough to live comfortably. But it wasn't a bribe. Bribes are for silence. This was payment for a service. He had performed the service of friendship to her dying son. Go now, she told him, and keep him in your heart. Do not let the world turn him into a monster. Bratfisch left the Hofburg. He walked out into the bright daylight of Vienna. He felt lighter. He had confessed. He had unburdened the secret to the one person who had the right to hear it. But the meeting with Cece also sealed his fate. He was now bound to the Habsburgs, not just by fear, but by honor. Cece had treated him with respect. She had touched his hand. He could never sell his story to the newspapers now. He could never gossip in the taverns. He owed her his silence. This silence became his prison. The Fiacre King returned to his cab, but he was a changed man. The other drivers noticed. Knockerl didn't joke as much. He didn't whistle as often. When people asked about Rudolf, he went stone cold. "I know nothing," he would say. "I am just a driver." He had survived the massacre. He had survived the macabre cargo drive. He had survived the interrogation of the Empress. But survival has a cost. Josef Bratfisch was carrying the weight of an empire's grief on his shoulders. He went back to the streets, picking up drunks and lovers, driving them around the Ringstrasse, whistling his tunes. But every time he passed the road to Mayerling, he must have shivered. He had looked into the eyes of Sisi and seen the same void he saw in Rudolf's. He realized that the gold and the velvet were just decorations on a coffin. The truth was the only thing that mattered, and the truth was unbearable. Money is supposed to fix things. For Josef Bratfisch, money was the final nail in the coffin. After the tragedy at Mayerling, the Habsburg machine wanted to ensure the silence of the only witness who mattered. The Emperor and Empress granted him a generous sum, 25,000 gulden. In 1889, that was a fortune. It was enough to buy a large house, a new stable, and a fleet of carriages. Overnight, the cab driver became a wealthy man. But everyone in Vienna knew where the money came from. It was blood money. It was the price of a prince's life. When Bratfisch walked down the street in his new clothes, people didn't look at him with respect. They looked at him with curiosity and suspicion. "That's him," they whispered. "That's the man who knows." Bratfisch tried to return to his old life. He bought a house in the Hernals district. He set up his own transport business. He tried to be the jolly Knockerl again. He went to the taverns. He ordered the wine. But when the musicians started playing, when the violinist struck up a waltz, Bratfisch would go quiet. The music wasn't joy anymore. It was a trigger. Every time he heard the Blue Danube, he was back in that freezing room, watching a gun resting on a table next to a bottle of champagne. He stopped whistling. This is the most tragic detail of his decline. The art whistler of Vienna, the man whose voice was his instrument, fell silent. How could he whistle? The last time he had performed, it was a prelude to murder. His gift had been corrupted. If he whistled a happy tune now, it felt like a betrayal, though, of the dead prince. So the music died inside him. The silence began to eat him alive. Psychology calls it PTSD today. In 1890, they just called it melancholy or nerves. Bratfisch had no one to talk to. He couldn't tell his wife the gruesome details of the macabre cargo. He couldn't tell his drinking buddies about the Empress's tears. He was trapped in a prison of secrets. He carried the ghosts of Rudolf and Mary Wetzera on his back every single day. His health began to fail rapidly. He was a strong man in his early 40s, used to hard physical labor. But after Mayerling, he withered. He lost weight. His face became gaunt. The spark in his eyes, the mischievous twinkle of the Fiacre, went out. He looked like a man who had seen something that human eyes were not meant to see. The irony is that the true culprits of Mayerling lived on. Emperor Franz Joseph lived for another 27 years, ruling his crumbling empire with ice-cold discipline. Empress Sisi wandered the world for another decade before her assassination. But the innocent bystander, the driver, was the one who broke. He wasn't built for the weight of history. He was built for the simple life of the street, and history had crushed him. By 1892, just 3 years after the tragedy, Bratfisch was dying. The official cause was throat cancer or laryngeal complications, a cruel, poetic irony for a famous whistler. His throat, the source of his art, turned against him, or perhaps he simply lost the will to live. He was 45 years old. He died on December 16, 1892. It was a quiet death. There were no state honors. No flags flew at half-mast. The newspapers mentioned it briefly. The Leibfiaker of the late Crown Prince has died. Most of Vienna had already moved on to the next scandal. They had forgotten the man who drove the hearse through the blizzard. But the Habsburgs didn't forget. They breathed a sigh of relief. The loose end was tied up. The witness was gone. Bratfisch took the secrets of that night to his grave in the Hernals Cemetery. He never wrote a memoir. He never sold an interview. He kept his promise to Cece. He was loyal to the end. His grave is still there today. It is a modest stone. Sometimes people leave flowers. Sometimes historians visit. But mostly it is ignored. It sits in silence, just like the man who lies beneath it. The legend of Josef Bratfisch is not about the politics of the empire. It is about the cost of loyalty. He was a man who loved a prince not for his crown but for his humanity. He served that prince in life, entertaining him in the taverns. He served him in death, whistling him into the darkness. And he served him in the afterlife, guarding his reputation with a silence that cost him his life. The carriage number 147 eventually disappeared. The horses died. The stables were torn down. The Vienna of the fiacres faded away, replaced by cars and trams. But the image remains. A carriage driving through a snowy forest, a driver hunched against the wind, carrying a dead girl and a broken empire into the night. If you listen closely to the wind in the Vienna woods today, you might not hear a waltz. You might hear a whistle, a lonely, frantic whistle trying to keep the darkness at bay. That is the song of Josef Bratfisch, the man who tried to save the world with a tune and failed. And that is the tragic, untold story of the coachman of death. Josef Bratfisch wasn't a politician or a general, but he saw more truth in one night than most emperors see in a lifetime. He reminds us that history isn't just made by the people who sign the treaties. It's witnessed by the people who drive the cars, clean the rooms, and bury the bodies. He was the last friend of a mad prince, and the only man who cared enough to whistle in the face of death. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. It helps the channel uncover more forgotten figures from the shadows of history. And I have a question for you. If you were Bratfisch, would you have kept the secret, or would you have sold the story and escaped the burden? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed. Next week, we are going deep into another royal mystery that they tried to burn. You don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.